Upon discovering this hobby of modern board gaming, it took quite a long time before I investigated abstract games, abstract strategy games, as they're sometimes called. The reason for this is because suddenly I was looking at all these exciting, pretty sort of games with nice themes, and it was all very exciting and new, whereas abstract strategy games felt like something from my past, whether we're talking about chess or drafts, checkers, or even something as simple as noughts and crosses or Connect Four. And that felt like something that had been around forever, and I'd pretty much ignored it all my life, so why would I pick it up now? But as I've delved more and more into playing games and designing games, I've realised that the simplicity of the mechanisms in these abstract games is fascinating. Not all the games that I'm going to show you in this video can genuinely be called modern board games. Some of them have been around for quite a long time, but there's still a place for them in the modern world, and you can't really... the simplicity of them can't really be criticised, in comparison to these other games with their complex rules and their convoluted mechanics. These are games that can largely be taught in a minute or 2 minutes. They can be learnt practically, straight away, and yet they can take a long time to really get very, very good at. They can be played extremely competitively, but often they can be played very quickly. Often they play very well with 2 players, and sometimes they can be extremely attractive. The first games that we're going to look at are games which include travel, so where playing pieces are moving from one location to another. An example of a game which uses travel would be, let's have a look at Quarador. So Quarador is a classic game from Gigamic. This is it's by no means an old game. We're not talking 30, 40, 50 years, but we're talking 20 years at least, and it's become a massive seller and a fairly mainstream sort of game. In Quarador, a player is aiming to get their pawn to the opponent's line at the end of the grid here. And on their turn, they can do one of 2 things. They can either move 1 step forward or 1 step sideways, or they could choose to place a wall so it goes somewhere, usually blocking their opponent in some way. So this player might move here, this player might place another wall, and then this player goes here, and then the player starts his advance. This player does the same, and so we move on. And then he thinks, right, he's going to block him a little bit, but he sidesteps it. So he places another one, he sidesteps again, and then the white continues his movement. And so you can see how this grid will fill up with walls, and a maze will start to be created as the player tries to get to the end, or as the red player tries to get to this end. Another travel game is this game, The Climbers, or Die Aufsteiger. This company I've seen has recently stopped trading, so it's hard to get hold of copies of this. But this is an example of how beautiful these games can really be. And this game plays best with multiple players, not just with 2. In The Climbers, or Die Aufsteiger, each player will help in setting up this tower that's randomly determined with these blocks, and then these little pawns are going to try and climb up the tower to get towards the top of the tower, and they want to get to a point where they're higher than everybody else and nobody else can get any higher. So gradually this tower is going to change. They can only move onto blocks of their own colour, so the pink player here could only move onto blocks that have a pink surface, or blocks that have one of this pale grey surface, which is a neutral colour that anyone can move onto. Once per game, they can use one of these large ladders to climb up a distance which they couldn't normally manage. They can also, once per game, use one of these small ladders to climb up a slightly smaller distance. They also have a little blocking pawn here, which once per game they can place, which means that another player would not be able to go on that space. So let's have a little look at how the game runs. next type of abstract strategy game we're going to look at is games where you capture the opponent's pieces. I mean, if we think of chess, where the goal is to take the king. In Hive, the goal is to capture the queen bee of your opponent's hive. In Hive, each player has 13 pieces which represent different insects. Each of these insects is on a sort of bakelite tile, and there's no board in this game, so these pieces are going to make up the board as we place them together. At the start of the game, each player is going to place one of their pieces, and they're going to go right next to each other like this. Throughout the rest of the game, the players are going to either add additional pieces to this hive here, or move pieces, and each individual type of piece moves differently depending on the insect that's portrayed on it. The queen bee can only move one space at a time, so it could move here, it could move here, it could move over here, or it could move up here. The beetle can also only move one space, but the beetle, as well as being able to move like this, it can also move onto the top of other pieces and then move about on top of pieces, thereby stopping them from being able to move in their own turn. The grasshopper can jump as far as it likes in a straight line, landing in the next available space. So for example, this grasshopper could jump up to here, it could jump down to here, or it could jump along here and land in the space there. A spider is able to move 3 spaces, so it could move 1, 2, 3, or it could move 1, 2, 3, or it could move 1, 2, 3. The soldier ant can use a single move to move all the way around the outside of the hive. So this ant could move as far as it likes, continuing around and stopping where it wants to around the outside of the hive. It's important to remember that at no time can a piece move in such a way that it separates the hive. And the game ends when one player's queen bee has been completely surrounded, either by the opponent's pieces or pieces of their own colour. In this case, the black player has lost because their queen bee has been captured. Of course, some games cross multiple genres, and certainly there are games which include that element of travel that we've already discussed, along with capturing. A recent example, and a very good example, would be the game Onitama. In a game of Onitama, each player has 5 pawns, one of these being the master. The aim of the game is to get the master into the opposing player's temple space, or to capture your opponent's master with one of your pawns. And the way you move is by using these movement cards that sit in front of you. This indicates where the piece currently is, and this indicates where it could go to. So if this player chose to use the crab, he could move this piece forward, and then on later turns he could potentially use it sideways if he uses the crab again. But once the card has been played, the card is placed over here and the person takes a new card. His opponent will then go and use their own card in order to move a piece, and then that card will be placed in the middle and they will retain the other one. And so the capabilities of these cards cycle and the players get the different abilities. Ultimately, a player wants to be in a position where they can capture their opponent's pieces, and best of all, if they can capture the opponent's master, they'll win the game. The other way to win the game is if the master gets onto the temple space belonging to their opponent, and then the game would end. The game has multiple cards with different movement types, and many of them aren't used in each game. So there's always lots of variety. No 2 games are ever the same, because you only ever have 5 of these cards in any one game. Another game which includes capture and travel would be a classic from my childhood, in fact I believe from my father's childhood. I don't know whether you can still get this in print, but if you can find a copy, even in a charity shop or thrift store, then it's well worth getting hold of a copy of Camelot, a great classic 2-player abstract strategy game. In Camelot, each player has a series of pieces which are made up of men and of knights on horseback. The aim of the game is to get your coloured pieces into the opponent's 2 starred spaces down at their side of the board. If you achieve that, if you have both spaces filled, then you win the game. On your turn, you can do one of three things. So the main thing that you'll be doing is moving either forward or in a diagonal or sideways direction. The other thing that you can do is jump over your opponent's pieces. So for example, on my turn, I could jump over here, taking this piece. I can then jump over here, taking this piece. And so you can make a chain of these jumps. The other option available to a player is to canter. Now this means jumping over their own piece. And again, these moves can be chained. So a player might jump over one piece, then canter over one piece, then canter over another piece, and that way they can move great distances. The difference between a knight and a man is that the knight can combine a jump and a canter. They have to initially do a canter and then a jump. So this knight, for example, could canter over this man, canter over this man, and then jump over his opponent, capturing him, jump over another opponent, capturing him, and continue his jump in this way and capture multiple pieces, as you can see. The game ends when one player has two pieces on the starred squares at the edge of their board, regardless of whether they're a man or whether they're a knight. The next group of games that I wanted to mention are games where we gain territory and we collect tokens and we place tokens around the board in order to claim areas of territory. So now we're moving into the area away from the sort of chess-like games and more towards that classic game of Go. So a very simple example would be something like Hey, That's My Fish by Fantasy Flight Games. But my favourite in this particular genre is Battle Sheep by Blue Orange Games. In Battle Sheep, each player places pastures which build up the board, so the board's different for every game. They also have a stack of sheep with sheep of their own colours on these thick plastic chips. Turns are simple. The player can move all of his stack or just part of his stack, but he must leave at least one disc behind, and they move as far as they can go in a straight line. So this player, for example, might choose to shift his stack over here and leave these ones behind. The player here might choose to move a large portion of his stack over here, and then the blue player moves his in a straight line to here, and so it continues with each player moving as far as they can and trying to block off portions of the board as they do so. And so it continues, and as we see, each player is now claiming territory on the board and trying to get in the way of what their opponents are doing. And once the game is over, these sheep will be spread all over the map. You then see how many of your sheep you've managed to get onto the separate spaces. You count those up and the player who's got the most wins. Very closely related to the territory control and that travel idea of moving from one location to another are the games where you connect one portion of the board to another portion of the board with a string of pieces. So the example that I'm going to show you on those lines is the game Punkt from the GIPF series of games. Now, GIPF was a project which had 6 or 7 different games in it, all of them abstract, all of them by Chris Burm. And these games, they had a very similar aesthetic, but slightly different gameplay. And there was a mechanism whereby you could, if you won one game, it would give you another playing piece you could use in another game. So you could have this sort of grand meta game going on while breaking off into little mini games of the other games. I don't know how often people actually did that, but the games in themselves are very good. So let's have a look at Punkt. In Punkt, each player has a selection of different pieces like this. One player has white and one player has all the black pieces. And these pieces are going to be placed onto this board, slotting into the little holes here. And the idea is to try and make a chain connecting one side of the board to the opposing side. So here to here, or here to here, and so on. And both players are trying to do that. So they would take it in turns to place one of their pieces on the board. And their choice on their turn is either to place a piece or to move a piece. Now, if a player chose to move a piece, they need to be able to move onto a piece which is already on the board and it's a piece of their colour. So, for example, this piece here can move in a straight line from the central dark space here and it must land on a piece of its own colour. So currently there is nowhere really for this piece to go, but supposing there was a piece, a black piece here and a white piece here, then you could have a situation where this piece would, let's put one more piece down here, this piece would move, it lands on a piece of its own colour, and then it may rotate. So the pieces can stack up like this, and gradually the players are trying to create a chain of their own colour across the board and block off the other player from doing the same as they go across the board in the other direction. The final example, and perhaps the most common, I think, example of these abstract games, is games where we connect a series of like pieces, like we mentioned Connect 4, where we're trying to connect up a bunch of pieces and make a line or a row. So a great example of that would be again, Gigamic, who make these lovely wooden games, this game Quarto. In Quarto, these wooden pieces do not belong to any particular player. Both players will be sharing them. And the pieces have 4 different qualities to them. Firstly, they're obviously either brown or they're this pale sort of colour, this white colour, I suppose. Then the second quality is they're either round or they're square. The third quality is they're either short or they're tall. And then they're either hollow or they're solid. So those are the 4 different categories, and on a player's turn, they're going to have the piece that they place dictated by the opposing player. So player 1 will choose which piece player 2 places. So player 1 might say you're going to be placing this piece, and player 2 will place it on the board somewhere. What player 2 is trying to achieve is to make a line of 4 pieces which have matching characteristics. So for example, this would be a line of 4 with matching characteristics because they're all white. Equally, this would be a line of 4 with matching characteristics because they're all round. Or we could say this would be a line of matching characteristics because they're all short. So players are going to take it in turns. After player 1 has given player 2 a piece to place, then player 2 will give player 1 a piece. And they're trying to select one so that that player cannot make a line of 4. So they might give them this one, for example, because there is no way of placing this to give them a matching row of 4. They're not all square, they're not all round, they're not all solid, they're not all hollow, they're not all short, they're not all tall, they're not all brown, they're not all white. So players have to think very carefully, just 1 or 2 steps ahead. If I give the player this piece, is that going to give them the opportunity to make a line of 4? In the more advanced version of the game, you can even win by making a square of 4. Another example, very similar to what we've just seen, is, again, Blue Orange's game. And this one is Goblet, which was Blue Orange's first game and did very, very well for them. Goblet is very similar in feel to Quarto, but it plays a little differently. Again, players are trying to make a row of 4, but they're trying to do it in their own colour. On a player's turn, they will take one of their pieces and place it somewhere on the board. You'll see that they've now revealed a smaller piece, and again this goes down, a bit like those old Russian dolls. So things get smaller and smaller. The next player will then do the same, and then this player might go here, and then this player now has the opportunity to place on the board here, and then but the alternative to that would be to move one of their existing pieces on the board and place it over the top. Now, of course, this opens up the possibility that players might forget where their pieces are. As more and more pieces go around the board and more things get covered up, eventually somebody might accidentally move a piece and uncover one of their opponent's pieces. If at any point there's a line of 4 matching colours, then that player wins the game. I mentioned earlier some of these games are very, very beautiful to look at. None of them that I've ever seen have been quite as beautiful as the game Haru Ichiban. particularly because I've got this lovely first edition in wood. But the board version, the cardboard version, is still very, very pretty. This is a Bruno Cathala abstract game from a couple of years ago, Haru Ichiban. In Haru Ichiban, each player has a pile of lily flowers, which each have a number between 1 and 8 on them. So they have numbers 1 to 8 in each player's stack. And the players are trying to make a pattern on the board of their flowers. So if they can get 4 in a cube like this in a square, they'll get 1 point. 4 in a row will be 2 points. 4 in a diagonal row, 3 points. And 5 in a row is 5 points if diagonal. These points are added up between different rounds, and once a player reaches 5, then they win the game. So in this instance, this would be an automatic victory if they could get 5 in a diagonal row. The way that the game actually works is that the players will select from 3 randomly drawn flowers, and they will place them face down to face off against their opponent. They then reveal which flower they have picked. So yellow here has picked a 5, red has picked a 7. Yellow has the lower, so yellow becomes the smaller gardener. Now what that means is that yellow's flower is placed onto the dark coloured lily pad over here. At this point, the bigger gardener, the person who played the bigger score, gets to place theirs on any lily pad on the pond. So they could place it here, for example. At this point, the small gardener can now push lily pads. So they can choose any selection of these tiles and move them. So for example, the player could push these 3 in this direction using what's called the spring wind. The large player then turns 1 more lily pad over to the dark side. So they might choose to turn over to here. And then we draw another tile each and place it into our little selection here. And each player will choose their next placement. So for example, yellow chooses this, red chooses this. They reveal. Now yellow is the lower value with a 6, so that gets placed on here. Red can place their tile anywhere, which is here. Yellow then gets to push a row, so they'll push them along here. And now red gets to choose another tile to turn over to the darker side. And so the game continues until somebody has completed one of those patterns. Over multiple rounds, the game ends when somebody has scored 5 points total. Now we've talked about several games that involve connecting 4 or connecting 5 pieces in a row or in a diagonal. These games have all been fairly simple, but when you come to a game like Yinch, this is another game from the GIPF project of games. Now this one is just sublime. It looks stark, but lovely. The pieces are nice and weighty and tactile, pieces of Bakelite sort of, pieces that click together. And the game is not complex to teach, but the strategy is really very clever and it's got a wonderful catch-up mechanic. So let's have a look at Yinch. In Yinch, one player is black and has these black rings on the board. The other player is white and has these white rings on the board. The players are trying to place these other markers onto the board, which are black on one side and white on the other. And once they complete a row of 5 of these markers in a line, then they win 1 point. And once 3 points have been won, the game is over. The way that a turn goes is that, say the white player was to go, they would place a white marker inside one of their rings and then move their ring across a little. The black player would then go, he could place one in here and move over here. Now the white player might go and he would move to here. The black player then goes to here. And now the white player might go here and move down here. Now the black player has a attack move that they can do now where they place a ring in here and they can jump over this, turning it to black. The white player likewise could put a white piece in here, jump over all of these and flip them to their opposite side. that may not be a good move. But ultimately, this is what we're doing until eventually there is a row of 5 of one colour. At that point, those tokens would all be taken off if there were 5 of them, along with 1 ring of the player who scored that point. So now they're now playing with fewer rings on the board, and so the other player has a chance to catch up. Once one player has taken 3 of their own rings off the board, then they have won the game. So there's a very brief look at a bunch of different abstract games, and the lovely thing about a video like this is that with abstract games I can really teach you the rules within a minute or 30 seconds, so I don't have to do those sort of very brief overviews that I would do with a Euro game. I can actually get into the meat of the game in very little time. These games are not going to be for everybody, but if you're drawn in by the beauty of the Euro games and the Ameritrash genres, I'm just going to urge you not to completely overlook the abstract games, because there's still a lot to explore in there and a lot of pleasure to be had in a short frame of time, particularly if you're playing as 2 people and in a short sort of time frame. These are great couples games, great games to play with family because they're so simple, great games to play with people who aren't familiar with this modern sort of world of board gaming. So there's my brief introduction to abstract strategy games.